In my previous video, I introduced experimental designs and I introduced the concepts of internal and external validity. In this video, I will be giving some details about the different threats to validity. So just a quick review about the types of validity. So internal validity is the degree to which changes in the dependent variable are actually associated with changes in the independent variable instead of extraneous variables. And external validity is the degree to which the findings of a study can be generalized beyond the context of the study. And in particular, in this video, we're focusing on the factors that threaten internal or external validity. So here is a list of them. I'm going to go through each of these. There are many of them, so I'll get right to it, starting with the threats to internal validity. One of the threats to internal validity is referred to as history. History is when events happen during the course of a study that influence the outcome. So let's say, for example, we're interested in examining anxiety, and in particular, we're going to compare the effect of an intervention versus a control group. Let's say the control group is set to be observed in week 1. The anxiety intervention group is scheduled to be observed in week 3, but in week 2, there's a major earthquake in the city in which the study is being conducted. So as you can imagine, a major earthquake might affect people's anxiety levels and may influence the people that are in the intervention group in a way that differs from the people in the control group, who were not exposed to the earthquake at the time that they were observed in week 1. So what can the researcher do differently? Well, in this example, I would advise the researcher to not schedule the two groups in different weeks like that, but try to, as much as you can, keep the schedule consistent for both groups across time. And that way, if when the earthquake happens, some members of each group are going to have already been observed or not been observed. Apart from that, there's not too much you can do. If it's something like an earthquake, obviously there's nothing you can do to stop that from happening. Let's consider maturation as another threat to internal validity. So maturation refers to when the results of a study are influenced by participants' natural growth, development, maturation, etc. For example, we might be looking at muscle growth, and we're looking at the effect of a high-protein diet. And in the diet group, we have 15 to 17-year-old boys, and in the control group, we have 21 to 23-year-old men. As you can imagine, those two different age groups of individuals are going to develop differently in terms of muscle growth, with or without an experimental manipulation. So we won't know if any results that we observe can be attributed to the diet versus just regular normal development. So what can the researcher do differently? Well, this was a pretty poor design to begin with. I wouldn't advise having such a dramatic difference in ages. If you have an experimental group and a control group, you should be trying to keep those two groups as similar as possible in terms of age and any other kind of identity metric that we could look at. Regression to the mean refers to the idea that when we look at extreme scores, people that perform really well or really poorly at one time point are likely to regress towards the mean, or if they did really well to begin with, they're likely to do a little worse the second time. If they did really poorly, they're likely to get better because there's no way to it's not likely to get any more extreme than they've already been. So just as a sports example, batting averages in different seasons. If you have a player who does really well one season, maybe they overperformed for what their ability is, and in the second season they'll do slightly worse. Maybe they underperform, as you see in the point shown at the bottom of the graph, and then in 2006 they perform a little bit better. So again, the most extreme scores are naturally likely to gravitate towards the mean. So if we take the top 10 and the bottom 10% of scores on some academic performance tests and put those into two different groups, give them a meditation intervention, on the post-test, it's going to seem like the meditation benefited the low ability group, but had the opposite effect on the high ability group just due to natural regression towards the mean. So what can the researcher do differently? I would advise the researcher just not to use extreme scorers. So instead of separating the top 10 and the bottom 10%, just split the group down the middle and take the top 50% and the bottom 50%, something like that instead. Selection refers to a threat to internal validity that occurs when participants are selected in such a way that predisposes them to certain outcomes. So if we have an experimental study that's scheduled for a Saturday, and we're basically just taking anyone who volunteers to show up at 8 a.m. to be in the experimental group and anyone who volunteers to show up at 2 p.m. to be in the control group, then we're likely to have fundamentally different groups. As you can imagine, people who volunteer to get up at early enough on a Saturday to be there by 8 a.m. are likely to be different from people who would rather volunteer to show up at 2 p.m. Maybe people that show up at 8 a.m. didn't go out the night before, tend to go to bed earlier, something like that. So there just might be just fundamental differences that predispose them to certain outcomes, regardless of what we're measuring in the study. So what I would advise the researcher to do differently is to just not base their study groups on the time. They can still have people volunteer to show up at different times, but try to make it so that half of the people who show up at 8 a.m. will be in the experimental group and control group. Same thing for the folks who show up at 2 p.m. Mortality, or sometimes called attrition, is referred to or is referring to when participants drop out of a study due to some reason that's related to the study variables. For example, if we're looking at mental health outcomes and there's some treatment that we're administering to our participants, and the treatment works so well that some participants decide they no longer need it and they drop out before the observation period is over, then we don't have very good representation from the people who, for whom the treatment worked really well. And so that could influence the findings of the study. Or conversely, participants who aren't benefiting from the treatment and have poorer mental health outcomes may be more likely to drop out than people who are benefiting. So in that case, we wouldn't have the representation of people for whom the treatment didn't work when we go to analyze our data. So what can the researcher do about this? They can incentivize completing the study. They can, for example, people who are not benefiting, they can reassure the participants that, the treatment may take some time to kick in, something like that. People who are benefiting from the treatment, maybe they can just kind of communicate the benefits of continuing the treatment and not taking it away. So just different ways of communicating and incentivizing completing the study. Diffusion of treatment refers to a situation where people begin to talk about the details of the study, and that causes them to know something about the study and then behave differently when they are participating in the study. So for example, consider this dialogue involving participants in a stereotype threat study. So Jim is in the stereotype threat group. He's speaking with John, who's in the control group. Jim says, "Can you believe what the researcher was saying about men being bad writers?" Then John says, "Huh? They didn't tell us that." And then they both realize, okay, that must be part of the study. And that might influence how they approach their participation later in the study. So what can the researcher do differently? Maybe not a whole lot, but the researcher can give instructions to participants, perhaps not to talk with others that they know who are in the study about the study until after it's completed. Compensatory demoralization and compensatory rivalry are two related threats to internal validity. This is when participants' outcomes are affected by their knowledge of unequal treatment between the study groups. So for example, let's say that there's an exercise study that's comparing a group that has an exercise referral program in which they get a free gym membership, and comparing that to a group who is only given some information about the health benefits of physical activity, just maybe some brochures or something like that. Well, one of the participants who's only receiving brochures finds out that some of the subjects in this study are getting a free gym pass and they're not getting a free gym pass, and they become angry. And if they exhibit compensatory demoralization, what that would look like is they would basically give up. So to hell with this study, I'm not going to exercise at all now. In the case of rivalry, they would basically take the opposite approach, where they're going to be extra motivated to basically defeat the experimental group. So I'll show them I'm going to get up and run 10 miles every day until the study's over. So what can the researcher do differently? Try as much as possible to balance the benefits across both of those groups, even if it means giving the control group the free gym membership at the end of the study. So just assuring them that they will eventually be getting the same benefits that are afforded the experimental group. Testing and instrumentation are two related threats to internal validity. Testing is when participants, by taking a pretest and getting some practice on that test, then do better on the post-test than they would otherwise. So simply because they've already seen the questions, they do better on the second attempt. So this is like having a practice effect. So to try and combat that, a researcher might use a different instrument for the pre and post test, and then that could lead to an issue of instrumentation where just by using different instruments, that might influence the outcomes. So the researcher has a dilemma here. They can either keep the test the same and maybe see an effect of testing, or they can try and vary the test by using like different versions of the test, and that could lead to instrumentation because maybe those two tests aren't the same at measuring whatever it is that they're trying to measure. So what can the researcher do? So I referred to a design called the Solomon four groups design, which is basically a design where half of your participants are getting a pretest and half are not getting a pretest. So you can actually see if there's an effect of the pretest on the post-test. With instrumentation, there's different ways of validating different versions of tests to make sure that they perform equally well at measuring whatever it is that you intend to measure, and that's called parallel forms reliability. You don't need to know that now. We'll cover that later in the course, but there are some steps that the researchers can take to try and alleviate these problems. Here's a summary of researcher actions for trying to optimize internal validity as much as possible. So go ahead and pause the video, read this list. I'm not going to read it to you, but just ask me any questions that you have, write down any questions and bring them to class. Now I'll cover some threats to external validity. There are not as many of these. So let's start with what's known as reactive arrangements, also called reactivity. This is when knowing that someone is being observed influences their behavior, their outcomes on the study. So for example, if participants are being monitored with, say, like a smartwatch or some wearable device that's monitoring their health behaviors, and they know that later there are going to be researchers who access that data about them, that might actually motivate them to behave a certain way just because they know they're being watched. So this actually happened to me recently. I participated in a study. I had a device connected to me that was assessing whether I was lying down, sitting, standing, or moving, and just knowing that that device was on me probably caused me to be a little bit more physically active than I tend to be. If you have to fill out a calorie log every day of your diet, just because you have to go through that step of writing everything down, that might actually cause you to eat less. Maybe you don't feel like writing it down, so you're just not going to have a piece of candy because you don't feel like having to look up the calories or something. This is sometimes known as the Hawthorne effect. So you can Google that if you want more information about why it's called that. It refers back to some studies that were done decades ago. But this kind of relates back to diffusion of treatment, compensatory demoralization, rivalry, as I talked about before, because it deals with people's sort of knowledge of the study and the fact that they're being observed in a research study, and that causes them to behave differently. So what can the researcher do differently? Basically try to make the measurement tool as invisible as possible. So if there's like a smartphone app that people can just take a picture of what they eat, and that can help detect their calories, or the researcher can get a research assistant to figure all that out for the participant, just so it takes away that effort. That may help. Making sure that the device is basically as comfortable, as not noticeable as possible if it's tracking someone's physical activity behaviors. And then 3 other threats to external validity are called the interaction of treatment and either selection, setting, or history. So selection refers to when the characteristics of your participants are too narrow. So for example, if I have a very specific population, Division III athletes at Springfield College, then the treatment effect may not be generalizable to other people. So again, we're talking about threats to external validity, which is related to generalizability. So we might not be able to generalize to other people if we have an interaction of treatment and selection. If we have an interaction of treatment and setting, it's because the characteristics of the setting are too narrow. So maybe we're doing something in a laboratory setting, and that whatever we find out from our study, the treatment effect may not be generalizable to other settings. If there's an interaction of treatment in history, then that means that the characteristics of the time period in which we're conducting our study are too narrow. So for example, if we're interested in social media and we do a study using MySpace, which I don't know if it still exists, but it once was a social media platform around the time that Facebook was invented, but is either doesn't exist anymore or isn't very popular. So we might not know if we can generalize what's known about a MySpace intervention to other platforms that are currently relevant, like Instagram and Facebook, etc. So something like in that example, the findings may not be generalizable to other time periods. So here's a summary of researcher actions for trying to optimize external validity. So it's some of the same things that I said for internal validity, but also some others that help, again, to optimize the degree to which we can generalize our findings. And that is it for this video. Have a great day.